Welcome to something that has been so long coming. I'm so happy that we're finally here and that we're finally doing this. We're going to have a couple of conversations about something that's really important. We're going to be talking about sex. And unfortunately, it's not the good kind of sex. We're going to be talking about sexual violence. I know I'm smiling, but not because it's not a serious issue. It's already very somber, but I'm just trying for us to have a conversation, an informal but very informative conversation about it, because sexual violence is something that happens in our society. Right here in South Africa, the president has even called it an epidemic, because it happens so much. And specifically, we're going to be talking about sexual violence within religious communities. So we're going to talk about sexual violence within the church. Rape within the church, specifically the kind of sexual violence that is perpetrated by somebody who's in a position of authority within the church situation, space, context. And I want to preface that with the reason why we're going to have this conversation, or why I'm here to talk about this particular issue. Firstly, yes, it's important. Secondly, because it happens. We're not going to be debating whether or not it happens, because it happens. If it hasn't happened to you or somebody you love, we thank Jesus for that. But it's a sad reality for a lot of people. Thirdly, I lost my count. We're going to be talking about it because for me, so I have a background in psychology. I'm a psychologist by training. And I've done a previous study around sexual violence and sexual abuse. That study specifically actually looked at how people who are sexually abused, how they can turn to religion for coping. And actually in my study, I found that people who are religious tend to cope better because they're able to look to God, or, their sense of spirituality as an extra coping mechanism, than people who don't. But also because I'm now taking a new route, and I'm now in studying human rights law, and I'm doing another study, and in this study I'm basically looking at sexual violence now being perpetrated by the people who would have in my previous study been kind of champions of coping, where people go to their pastors for counseling, and they go there for some spiritual guidance on how to cope with it. But in this context, the people we trust, the people we love, the people we look up to are the ones who are actually perpetrating sexual violence. And specifically, a lot has been said about sexual violence in Catholic spaces, and a lot has been said about sexual violence against children. And that's a very important topic, and that's a very important place to speak and to champion and to be advocates for. But there's another space where there's so many silences, and that's sexual violence against adult women. Because it happens. Adults who are at consenting age, but they are raped within the context of the church. And I'm going to use the word church as an institution. And I will use whatever title, I'm more familiar with, pastor, but I'm speaking about pastor, bishop, evangelist, minister, prophet, whatever your man, woman of God, whatever the title it is that you use, that's what we're talking about. So we're talking about sexual violence that happens in what's supposed to be protected spaces. And unfortunately, that's how sexual violence and harassment happens. It's normally in the context of protected spaces. So yes, you do have instances where you went somewhere and somebody was lurking somewhere and they jumped in. That happens. But unfortunately, a lot of the times, women are victims of sexual abuse in the hands of people they know, and in the hands of people that they have previously trusted. And that's what happens in churches, because, hey, we go to churches because, one, we are looking for God, and we go there believing that this person who has ascended to this elevated position of bishop, pastor, prophet, they're above reproach. They do the right things. They hear God. They have our best interest at heart. But the reality is we have a lot of sexual predators on the pulpit. That's it. And it's not me attacking a person, a church, a place. It's just stating the reality of what's happening in our world as far as sexual violence is concerned. So this is a really important topic, which I feel like there's a lot of silences about. It's not been given a lot of attention because of a lot of things, because of silences, because victims don't speak out, but also because when they do speak out, they're being told, hey, no, things were going right, and then you had an affair, and then things stopped working out between you and the man of God, and now you want to come and say, cry wolf. And those are the kind of narratives that people who have been victims of sexual abuse have had to contend with. And so they just rather keep quiet. But I'm here to say, you know what? Me Too happens in church too. And that's actually a hashtag, in church too, because it does happen in church. And for now, this is the assignment that God has given me. For us to speak about that and have informed conversations that I hope will empower you to help a person that might have gone through something like this, or that will empower you to hopefully see the danger from afar and be able to, flee and escape it. Or if it has happened to you, for you to kind of have the tools on, okay, what to do now, because a lot of the times, even the people around us, thank God when they're present, and thank God when they believe us. But sometimes they just don't know what to do and what to say. And I guess this is the space that I'm hopefully going to come in so we can help each other and empower each other on, hey, when something like this happens, most of the time, because it's not a one solution fits every scenario, but most of the time when somebody comes to you and says, hey, this happened, what should you do as the person who's being told that in confidence? Because you need to imagine what it has taken that person to come to you and tell you that. And unfortunately, there's this really bad culture within the church of dismissing victims, of not believing them because, hey, she's tarnishing the man of God, and souls are at stake and all of that. And I'll tell you now, and I put on my hat as a psychologist, the first thing that anybody who has been a victim of any kind of sexual violence, whatever form it takes, the primary thing they need is for you to believe them. If they were lying and you find that out at the end, well, then there will be consequences. But the risk of not believing somebody and then you find that they were telling the truth are far greater. And that's me in my psychologist hat, and we can agree to disagree, but at least as far as we know in research and therapy, that's the first thing that people need, and that makes a world of a difference on how everything else unravels. So did I tell you the name of the show? I don't think I did. Okay, so right now I'm thinking that the name that I have is going to be called Her Story. Maybe you can just tell me, give me some suggestions, tell me if you like the name or not, but that's the one I'm leaning towards, Her Story, because it's about her, she, and her story, and it's about giving a space and a voice to her story, and her is me, it's you, it's our sister, it's our cousin somewhere. And yeah, so she needs to be heard, and she has a story. Every her has a story anyway. So yeah, so I've got my paper. I'm going to be looking down sometimes, okay, because I just want to go through some of the highlights of what we're going to be discussing in future sittings. Let me not call it a show. Let me say in future sittings together, okay? So one of the things that we're going to be talking about is grooming, sexual grooming, and I'm going to explain this just a little bit. Okay, so grooming basically is a process that normally an abuser undertakes, and it's normally a very conscious, so they decide. So you see the manipulative element of it all. It's that process where they try to win your trust gradually. It's normally very gradually, just so that you can let your defenses down, so that they can have access to you, so that any suspicions that you might have, you start to relax your suspicions or any uncomfortableness that you might have. And I'll give an example. Within the church scenario, for example, it could be that certain pastor or minister, when they talk to you, they tap you on the shoulder. At first, it seems a little bit intimate. You're like, okay, what was that? But they do it again, and they do it in the context where there's other people. And then you start to question yourself, man, I think I read too much into it. He's just friendly. He's just nice, you know. And if he meant anything bad, he wouldn't be doing it in front of other people now, would he? Would he? Yeah. So it's that systematic, gradual process where the abuser starts working on getting you to trust them, start working on getting access to you. So it's even that random message, hi, my son, my daughter, my whatever it is that they call you, you know, at a random time, and you're thinking, oh, okay, man of God is thinking of me at this time. Okay. First it's a bit, okay, shouldn't he be, you know, doing something else? But it happens so frequently, and other people say, hey, you know, he called, he said, that you start to think, hey, it's normal. And that gets you to get your guards down. And it makes access to you so much easier, because remember, this is normally quite calculated and it happens over time. So we're going to be talking about grooming. So what does it look like and what you should watch out for, because a lot of the time when we talk about grooming, we talk about children being groomed, but adults are also groomed, even though they know what sex is and what happens in that context, but they can be groomed to let their defenses down, such that the pastor, prophet, bishop, father, whatever you want to call them, has access to them in an environment of trust, where you think absolutely nothing bad could possibly happen with this person. So that's one thing we're going to talk about. But we're also going to talk about doctrine and how doctrine is also used. It's actually part of the grooming process. So where scripture is manipulated, again, this doesn't happen like bam, you know. It normally happens gradually and subtly. You know, things that you had convictions about before get eroded. And I'll give you an example. So they can make an example they can use scriptures like, you know, they can use your reasonable acts of service, you know, and submission and worship, but, you know, and those things are just applied in the wrong context. So they can say, you know, you're serving, it's your reasonable act of service to the man of God, you know, to cater to his needs. And they don't say what the needs are, but you already now have something in your mind that says your reasonable act of service is catering to the needs of the man of God. They don't say, hey, my needs are sex. No. But gradually, the barriers and the walls come, you know, down, and you start to think, hey, I need to, you know, make sure that the man of God is properly catered for in this way, which normally would never have been something that you are even concerned about. But you start being worried about what the man of God eats, you know. And it's your reasonable act of service. It's your reasonable act of service. And that happens gradually until certain things that initially you would have never ever in your wildest dream thought of yourself doing, you start being okay with that. And you know, in that way, the most dangerous lie is the one that's mixed with truth. And that's what they do. They take scripture, which you know, it's true, vele, you've seen the verse, and they just dabble it, spice it a little bit with a lie. And somehow, because there's the truth, you end up taking the truth and the lie. So we're going to look at things like that, on how doctrine is used and how language is used. This is such a big one. God, we need time and grace for language, because language is such an important element of our existence, and we take it for granted because we talk every day, we use language every day, but in reality, language shapes our perception of reality. Okay, so the mere word that is used to describe a thing shapes your understanding of a thing. So if somebody, for example, off the top of my head, if somebody says, I went to a party and it was nice, okay, and then somebody who went to the same party says, yo, I had the experience of a lifetime. Same party. They're describing their experience, but the words that I use completely take on different meanings and perceptions in your mind. Because when somebody said it was nice, you're like, oh, okay. If I had the chance, I would go, I would not go. Hey. But if somebody says it was the experience of a lifetime, hey, now that's a completely different ball game. And that's how language is used in the church by these abusers on pulpits. So, you know, it's one thing when somebody says, you know, I'm happy you're here. I'm happy that God brought you to this church, you're a blessing. Versus when somebody says, God chose you. You are chosen for this place and you have an assignment in my life. Completely different. And language is manipulated by these people who most of the time are already very charismatic to begin with, because their whole life is about speaking and, getting people to see things in a certain way. So they already have that charisma on their side. Now they wield it for harm because they use language to manipulate and to groom people. And those are some of the things that we're going to talk about. So we're going to look at the language that is used. There's a really interesting study that was done in Zimbabwe about this, and I'm going to bring some of the insights from that. So we talk about the language that is used as part of sexual grooming for adults, okay, and sexual violence in the church. The other thing we're going to talk about is power. The power dynamics, and this is a really important and it's a really tricky one, and I'll tell you why. Because when we speak about power and we start to talk about whether or not the victim could have said no, she's an adult. Guy, do you mean to tell me a 30-year-old, 40-year-old woman couldn't have just said no? If she didn't say no, it means she wanted to, all of those things. They neglect a very important part of the relationship between a pastor, a prophet, a minister, a man of God, with the congregant. And that is the power dynamics, the power disparities that are at play. And by that I mean the power dynamic between the man of God and the member, the person who's attending, the congregant, is steep. And I'll tell you why. First of all, the clergy, which is your pastor, prophet, bishop, whatever you call them in your particular space, they enjoy power in two ways. And we'll go deeper when it's time for us to talk about these things. But the two ways that they enjoy power and authority in the relationship is positional and it's personal power. Now, positional power obviously is the power that's accrued to them by virtue of their position as pastor, bishop, minister, prophet, evangelist, whatever other titles they use. So they enjoy powers that come from their position, okay? They have spiritual knowledge that you don't have. They have the backing of the church as an institution. They have the backing of God. They are sanctioned by God as the mouthpiece of God, as the vessel of God, So that's positional. But then they also enjoy personal power. And personal power now is power that's accrued to them by reason of their personhood. The first one, sexual violence normally happens. Yes, it can happen between men and women and all that. But characteristically, majority of the time, it's perpetrated by a man. Now, we live in a patriarchal society, and that means men already have certain privileges simply for being men, simply because of their anatomy. Being born a male already gives a man certain powers and privileges. That's personal power he has before he abuses, before he comes into the relationship, before he thinks of abusing. He walks in with that kind of personal power. Okay, his manness, his maleness, let me rather say. Okay, but then he also has personal power because of certain characteristics that he might have. I touched on one before. Maybe he's this really charismatic guy. He knows how to talk. He knows how to really, get his point across. He's eloquent. He's likable. Lots of other characteristics that differ from individual to individual. But all I'm trying to say here is that this perpetrator, who is in a position of authority within a religious community or context, enjoys personal power and positional power. Now, the woman who is the victim is vulnerable, and her vulnerabilities are personal and they are also positional. They're positional because she's in need of what he has. He has the knowledge. Maybe she's been told that she's been possessed by a demon. There's a generational curse. Now she needs him because he has the knowledge, he has the authority, he has the power to cast out that demon out of her. He knows what needs to be done, how it needs to be cast out. Is it a fast? Is it prayer? Is it the laying of hands? He knows the remedy to cast out her demon. So she's vulnerable to him because he has the knowledge and the authority that she doesn't have insofar as that. And then she has personal vulnerabilities simply for being a woman in a man's world. And unfortunately, religious communities are highly patriarchal systems. It's just a fact of life. It is what it is. So she is vulnerable to him because she's a woman. She is vulnerable to him maybe because she comes from an she's uneducated, that kind of background. Maybe she's timid. Maybe she's not as charismatic as he is. She doesn't have friends. So just the mere fact of the power imbalance raises really important questions about consent. Do I really have the power to consent or not to consent when I'm in the presence of somebody who enjoys so much power over me? It's not that easy. People think no is all it takes to say, hey, I don't want this. And also, over and above that, it's also about what is consent and what is the lack of consent. So if I hit you physically but I don't say no with my mouth, have I consented? Have I not consented? You see, these are the intricacies that need to be ironed out, that we need to engage about. And also, maybe I'll bring this in now, is about this response. It's a human response that a lot of people don't know. So as people, when we are in danger, a lot of the time people say you can either fight or you can flee, right? But we've actually discovered there are actually more responses. And one of the responses is freeze. Have you ever seen like you crossing the road and a car almost bumps you, and instead of running, you just you freeze until the whole thing is over, and you could kick yourself. You could see, why didn't I run away? But in that moment, all your body knew to do was freeze. And that is actually a response. It's a valid response in the face of danger. And some of these women, if their response to the abuse is freezing, did they consent? Did they want? Do you understand? Was it legal? You know, so those are some of the controversial but necessary elements of sexual violence that we need to talk about when in the context of it happening around adults. You know, with children, we automatically accept their vulnerability because they're children and they don't have maybe a full understanding of what's happening and the grooming that happens of children and all of that. And I agree with that. But I guess my contention is if we understand that children are vulnerable, then why are we not understanding that adults are also vulnerable? It's not the same vulnerability, it's different, but it's still vulnerability. And I guess that's part of the things that we have to have conversations about too. Okay, so we're also going to be talking about healing, because ultimately, like I said in the beginning, I want to, hopefully by the grace of God, play my role in helping somebody who has gone through this heal, helping somebody who's a loved one of somebody who's gone through this with the tools on how to help their loved one to heal. And the healing is also quite a tricky thing, because so this is the thing. Our body is wired to self-preserve, and it's wired to heal. I'll make an example, biologically at least. Let me make the example biologically. So if you trip and fall, and you hurt your knee, you scrape your knee, without any intervention from a doctor, from spirit, or what is it, that purple thing, spirit that we put on our, where you get hurt, without any such intervention, your body already genetically it's wired to start doing some things, to start getting you to heal without your intervention, because it's wired like that for self-preservation and healing. And it's the same thing with our minds, with our psyche. Our psyche is wired to heal as well. And sometimes when things like this happen, it engages in an automated process of healing. Now, the danger about that is that sometimes the way that the mind wants to heal from the trauma is not healthy. It's not productive. It doesn't serve you. And that's where you find people, especially, I know this one's going to be difficult for some people, but you have people that forget their experience. Yeah, let it sink in. It happens. You have people who literally, it's too traumatic for the psyche to handle, and rather than do the work of processing it, which is so traumatic, so it's trauma upon trauma, the trauma of the experience and the trauma of processing it, the mind decides to just chuck it into your unconscious mind, and you really have no active recollection of that experience, especially when it happens in childhood. Now, I know there's things around false memories and whatever, but it does happen. It does happen, and it's part of how the brain tries to heal. And you find also people going into prostitution. I'm making an example. That's a maladaptive healing mechanism, because, hey, my power was taken in this instance, and if I am a prostitute, then I at least am in a position of power and authority because I am deciding that this is what I want to do. It's an example. So the healing and how we can set ourselves to heal as adaptively as possible is such an important conversation that we need to have. Also, questions around sexuality, and I know this is something that us church folk don't really, we have a stand, we have scripture about it, and hey, this is where we stand. Granted, I'll give you that, but important questions arise out of sexual violence that we can't deny. So, I'll give an example. If somebody was sexually violated by a preacher, priest, whatever, and it's a same-sex kind of violation, so it's man to man, woman to woman, and this was their first experience of sex. Now, you must know that your first experience of anything sets a precedence on how you will understand and assimilate that into your worldview going forward. So if this person's first experience of sex was abusive one, and it was male on male, hey, they go through whatever they go through to process it. Now, later, when they're now having to process their own sexual identity, because their sexual experience was grounded firstly in a male on male experience, you can find, and I'm not saying people are homosexual because of this, please don't misquote me, but I'm saying that experience can bring up questions about one's sexuality because one's sexuality was grounded in a same-sex experience, for example. Or even ideas around, and I know it has happened, where the abuse happened for so long, over an extended period of time, where it got to a point where the person in question, you know what, it's easier if, oh, you're here to do it, okay, let me assume the position, okay, and then, okay, are you done, okay, because that sometimes is somebody's defense mechanism. So that then in the long run brings up certain questions about, oh, okay, so if did I let it happen? And if I did I want it? Did I consent? These are questions that people ask themselves within themselves, and they are conflicted. And while they're going through their conflict, there's somebody saying, yeah, you are a liar. It didn't happen. You want to bring the man of God down. So I cannot stress the importance of, if you can't believe them, then hold your tongue at least until you know, as a matter of fact, not of opinion, what actually happened. Because it's a lot to deal with. So these are the things, I just want to check that I didn't forget. These are the things that we're going to be discussing in conversations that are going to follow. So I would really, really appreciate it if you like my page. The details are going to be put down here, and pretty soon we're going to have our first conversation. And please, if you have topics or questions that you think we need to talk about, please send me a message, and then we'll look into it. And I'm really hoping for this to be a space where, even if we might have different opinions, that we are united at least in the goal and in the purpose, which is empowering her, allowing her to tell her story, and allowing and giving her story a voice, allowing it to have a voice, empowering her story to have a voice. So we can disagree. Absolutely, but let's do it respectfully. Let's do it lovingly. We can lovingly disagree. It's a thing. It happens. And that's what I'm hoping for. Yeah. So please come with me on this journey. I'm excited about it. I'm excited because I believe that it carries hope and healing and empowerment for someone. and that someone might be me as well. So yeah, I'm looking forward to it, and thank you for giving me your time. Thank you for watching. I'm really excited for these sessions with you. And yeah, and oh, one last thing, please, before I forget, this is not an attempt to bash any person, any man, woman of God, any church or anything like that. So mine is not to be naming and shaming a particular place, church, person. That's not part of my assignment, at least not for now. And I understand that there are people who feel led to do that, and I've got no beef with those people. But so yeah, if you're looking for naming and shaming, that's not what you're gonna find here. Yeah. Okay, enough with the serious stuff. So I am excited. I cannot wait for our sisterhood, for this family that we're going to be creating together. And while it's her story, men are also invited, because hey, we wouldn't be having this conversation largely if they were not here. So yeah, click the subscribe button and see you soon.